Okay, today we're going to review what will happen when the economy is operating in a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap. If the government does nothing to correct the problem that's going on in the economy, in the short run we'll have a recessionary gap and wages will be sticky. But we know that in the long run, in a recessionary gap, wages will drop, which will lead to a drop in our aggregate supply, returning our economy to long-run equilibrium. And then in an inflationary gap, the opposite will happen. Wages will rise in the long run, increasing our aggregate supply curve and bringing it back to long-run equilibrium. Fiscal policy, we learned there are two things that the government can do when we're in a recession, and those two things are to increase government spending or to decrease taxes. Increasing government spending will lead to an increase in our aggregate demand curve, right? Because aggregate demand curve is made up of C plus I plus G plus XN. So an increase in G will lead to an increase in our aggregate demand, leading to an increase in price level, okay? Returning us to long-run equilibrium. If the government decreases taxes, that will lead to an increase in disposable income, which leads to an increase in consumption, and ultimately an increase in that aggregate demand, returning us to equilibrium. If we're operating in inflation, they would do the opposite. So the government would decrease spending or increase taxes. Decreasing government spending would lead to a decrease in our AD, shifting us to equilibrium. An increase in taxes will lead to a decrease in disposable income, a decrease in consumption, and a decrease in AD. Then we learned there are three measures, three different policies the government can put into place, and this is actually done by the Federal Reserve, okay? The Federal Reserve can either increase or decrease the required reserve ratio, increase or decrease the discount rate, or use open market operations. So in a recession, the government would, the Fed would decrease the required reserve, allowing the banks to loan out more money to stimulate the economy, increasing our aggregate demand curve. The discount rate, which is the rate that the Fed charges the banks to borrow money, they could decrease that, allowing banks to borrow more, lend more out, and eventually increasing our aggregate demand. And when it comes to open market operations, we learned our helpful hints that open market operations, the Fed will buy bonds, buy to make the money supply bigger, buy bigger, and then we will over here have sell bonds to make the money supply smaller, and these would go in the opposite direction. Raise the required reserve, which will decrease the AD, and they could also decrease the discount rate, decreasing our AD, and bringing all of these are policies that will bring our economy back to long-run equilibrium. And then initially we learned that eventually we do have a self-correcting economy. If left alone over time, but it might be years and years, will correct back to long-run equilibrium because of the wages. Hope that helps. Thank you.